Good afternoon, everyone. We hope you're enjoying the conference so far and trust that you've had an enjoyable lunch and have had some time to visit the gallery area. A few housekeeping items I'd like to share with the audience. If you happen to have issues joining a session, simply refresh your browser and rejoin. For those of you who have had some questions about obtaining CEUs for the conference, that information can be found in the reception area. And certainly continue to share on social media. We would love to hear from you and the insights that you're gaining from the conference, and be sure to use hashtag StudentSuccessWV. We are giving away some cool prize packages each day, so you want to be sure and get in on those. With that said, we want to thank you for joining us for the afternoon's plenary session. Again, my name is Elizabeth Manuel, and I'm the Senior Director of Student Services for both the West Virginia Higher Education Policy Commission and the Community and Technical College System. As we get started, we do want to remind you to please feel free to jot any questions that you may have throughout this presentation in the session chat box just to the right of the screen. At the end of the speaker's presentation, we will address any of those questions that happen to come in. So with that, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing this afternoon's plenary session titled Insights and Outlooks, Advocacy for Student Success. Our plenary speaker has worked in higher education and college access fields her entire professional career. A former Pell Grant recipient herself, she personally understands the imperative to help more underserved students. She serves as the editorial board on the Journal of College Access, the advisory board of the American University Center for Postsecondary Readiness and Success, and is often consulted to speak on federal policy issues. Her passion to advocate for inclusive and equitable practices for college access and success collaboratives led her to her current journey of serving more than 2 million students annually to achieve higher college enrollment and graduation rates across the nation. She was also recently recognized as the White House Champion of Change for College Opportunity. Here to discuss her take on advocacy for students, Executive Director of the National College Attainment Network, please welcome Kim Cook.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that introduction and the invitation to join you today. NCAN works with nearly 500 member organizations, school districts, and higher ed institutions across the country to close equity gaps in post-secondary access and attainment. I'm especially proud to be here with members of the West Virginia College Access Network, our newest addition to statewide college attainment coalitions. My thanks go to all of you, especially the Education Alliance, for their leadership in its creation. I'm both excited and sobered for our discussion today. Equity has been top of mind for us at NCAN, particularly as we look at stories like this cover from Time Magazine, calling this year the lost year for a generation of students. We knew in our hearts and the early experiences of our advisors across the country that this was a slow motion crisis in the making. Data I'm about to share verify that for our heads. The findings are a stunning confirmation of our worst fears overall, and more so for our students from high poverty and high minority high schools. Today, these data confirm our worst fears of the manifestation of over a year of disruption of students from their learning, their support systems, and their basic needs. The data confirm the early warning signs we experienced: declines in FAFSA completion, declines in fee waiver applications, and declines in college applications were indeed the proverbial canaries in the coal mine of what was to come for the high school classes of 20 and 21. We must respond to this crisis of opportunity, equity, and economic health of our country. These data should be an urgent call to action. It will not surprise anyone in the audience today to hear that students across the country are imperiled. Their education pathways have been disrupted. Many have consequently made compromises and hard choices about their educational futures. We know that our most vulnerable students, students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, and first-generation students have been negatively impacted disproportionately. The consequences are severe not just for them, but also for their families, communities, states, and our country overall. We see this in the data. Our Form Your Future FAFSA tracker showed double-digit percentage declines in FAFSA completions, again with disproportionate impacts on Title I and high minority high schools. The Common App tells us that college applications have also decreased significantly. and the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, which draws its data from the enrollment records of thousands of post-secondary institutions serving millions of students, documented historic enrollment declines this fall. Despite these declines in financial aid and college applications and college enrollment, students and those involved in their post-secondary success have made Herculean efforts to stay on post-secondary pathways. We have heard stories of innovative practices from across the country that NCAN member programs have made to stay connected with students and families, from virtual financial aid nights to chatbots to even using drive-in movie theaters to promote FAFSA completion. Everyone involved in these efforts should be commended. Every student continuing to strive for post-secondary access and attainment should be applauded. And every student who still aspires to attain a degree or credential but does not see a way forward surely must be existed. This problem is larger than students or school districts or even state-level policymakers, although each surely has a role to play. The size of our present problem is so large, the scope of the need is so vast. At this point, the federal government seems the only actor with enough leverage and resources to adequately respond to the challenge. Student need has skyrocketed due to job loss and catastrophic medical expenses. Our students need immediate need-based aid that could come in the form of doubling the Pell Grant. Later in my deck, we'll look at some promising policy developments and federal funding to support this work. I'm going to launch into a bit of a national landscape here with some very fast-moving data points. Elizabeth assures me that we'll be able to share this deck out with you. So I'd encourage you to take these in as a broad thinking and know that you'll have the opportunity to dig in later to the actual data. I will tell you that I'm going to move quickly, again, because this is context setting that will really inform what the actions we can and should take will be. So let's look at pre-pandemic. And let's remind ourselves that as we often say we need to return to normal or the new normal, that wasn't so great either. So again, there were large disparities by race and income in particular in enrollment rates. This slide is again from the National Student Clearinghouse, showing that in high poverty and low income schools, enrollment rates were 54% and 55% respectively. And what those were at higher income and low poverty schools, upwards of 15 and 20% higher for enrollment numbers. As far as completion numbers, even larger gaps between high poverty and low poverty schools, 30% gap in their completion numbers for students. And in low income and high income, another 20% gap of completion. So really important that as we think and talk about this return to a new normal, that we really should be aspiring to return to better than what normal was pre-pandemic. But let's dive in to what happened as the world changed radically in the late winter, early spring of 2019. This survey research from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was done early on and asked what parents thought were the likelihood of losing their job and what they thought the likelihood of a change in the post-high school plans for their children would be. These are stunning numbers where even the low numbers are 40% likely to lose job. But look at how this changes, and again, the racial disparities between Hispanic, Black, and white students. Again, making the case that non-white parents felt more likely to lose their job, and looking at what that meant to a change in post-high school plans. Again, a disproportionate impact on Hispanic and Black students, but still stunning numbers overall. Strata's done some recent work, and this is just from last month, about what changes in education considerations students were flagging. Top one here you'll see listed is less expensive program, followed closely by closer to home. When asked what was fueling that or largest influence on the decision not to get more education, the top answer was anxiety, stress, uncertainty, followed closely by what I think is a pretty related financial pressure on me and my family, also including needing to care for a family member, struggling with grades, and schools not providing the kind of experience or support they sought. When we look at FAFSA completion, the free application for federal student aid, which unlocks federal student aid and in most states, state aid and institutional aid, these numbers really told the story that we helped us predict and be harbingers of what was to come. Overall, FAFSA completion is down by about 5.9% this year. But when we look at this by Title I eligibility, that's higher at 6.8%. When we look at this by students of color, down by 8.4%. When we look at this as geographic locale, rural, town, and city taking bigger hits. Again, a theme of disproportionate and exacerbated inequities. This is the one chart I would encourage you to sit with. It's tough news. This is the National Student Clearinghouse high school benchmarks talking about immediate fall enrollments for the classes of 2019 in the blue-gray number and the class of 2020 in what I think is showing up on your screen as an orange number. So in the past, we had seen that number in the 1.5, maybe coming up to 2% dip. What we saw in fall of 2020 was historic, an overall drop of 6.8%. And you'll see my highlighted numbers again, talking about that disproportionate impact and exacerbated inequities. High poverty enrollment dropping by 11.4%, low income enrollment dropping by 10.7%, high minority 9.4%, urban 7.5%. We're getting some early data now on where the attrition happened. And you'll see on this that most of the attrition happened at community colleges, which is a conversation we should continue to have about which students community colleges serve and what that says for the future of enrollment. Going to transition here to talk more about college affordability. That is pre-pandemic, during pandemic, and post-pandemic. This continues to be data that we think really inform our advocacy and policy. NCAN does an annual report called The Growing Gap, where we look at affordability for students at public institutions of higher education, both 2-year and 4-year. And I'll tell you briefly, our formula and the methodology there is for the student who, quote unquote, does everything right, who files their FAFSA, completes it on time, is Pell eligible, takes the subsidized loan, works a little bit during the year, perhaps work study, has some summer savings, may have an expected family contribution. So this includes a lot of self-help and a lot of meeting deadlines. Here's what the key findings were. Only 23% of public 4-year institutions were affordable to a student using that formula. 41% of public 2 years were affordable. The affordability gap at 4 years was about $2,500. The affordability gap at 2 years, I'm sorry if I said the 2,500 was 4 year. The affordability gap at 2 years was $855. There are some not encouraging trends here either. Since we started this research in 2014, the percent of affordable 4-year public institutions has dropped from 31% to 23%. But the affordability gap in dollars has just about doubled from $1,272 to $2,524. Looking at 2-year affordability, a little less of a drop, but still a drop from 49% to 41%, and a huge decline percentage-wise from $240 to $855. I asked my colleagues to prepare a couple about West Virginia so that we can put that in perspective against national. So this is the West Virginia version of some of the national landscape that I just shared earlier. On degree attainment and enrollment, percent of adults 25 to 64 with associates are higher. West Virginia at 32%, national average at 44%. Percent of adults enrolled in college, 18 to 24, West Virginia 37%, US 42%. So slight lags for West Virginia on both of those measures. Percentage of students that are affordable would bring up an interesting conversation for you all, in that your 2 years are very affordable in West Virginia And your 4 years running at about the national average. Again, that national average is still devastating and nothing to write home about, but West Virginia falling kind of within that bar. Again, affordability gaps for West Virginia, much lower in the 2-year sector because of your affordability, and significantly lower than national in the 4-year at $191. It's kind of a wrap up about state aid and Pell Grants in relation to FAFSA completion. Average undergraduate state grant aid per FTE across the country is $930, West Virginia at $1,040, so trending slightly ahead in a good way. Total Pell Grant recipients, about 50,000 students. Total Pell Grant dollars, significant number of significant federal investment in West Virginia's students. FAFSA completion among high school seniors this year was 59%. I'll put that in context in a minute. And your state rank for FAFSA completion among high school seniors was 15th. There is some good news, bad news buried in those numbers. This year's FAFSA completions are 5.1% fewer completions than the class of 2020. And unfortunately, West Virginia is trailing national trends in terms of completions year to year. So you had a drop of about 1,300 FAFSAs. Compared year to year, West Virginia ranks 52nd because we include the District in Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico in those, with a percent change of 11.8%. So your completion was 15th in the country, but the year over year, West Virginia took a significant hit for this year graduating high school seniors. Again, this is the national current rank is about 20% for the year that we're in right now. So staging a bit of a comeback. That's a lot of data. And I just ask you to keep it more as context setting as we jump into this advocacy piece that I was asked to share with you. So to do that, I'm going to talk about NCAN's top 3 policy priorities and then some new opportunities that have come on the scene from the federal government. NCAN's top 3 policy priorities are around simplification of the free application for federal student aid, doubling the Pell Grant, and supporting all of our learners, including DACA students. I'll dive into each one of those briefly. FAFSA simplification, to see the FAFSA, to know it is to love it, all 108 plus questions of it. We have long advocated that this is a barrier and that there are many unnecessary questions and processes such as back-end verification. So we were delighted to celebrate some policy wins. In December of 2019, the Future Act was signed into law. It's not yet effective, but it was signed into law, and that will enable data sharing directly with the Internal Revenue Service to take about 22 questions off the FAFSA by just doing direct data service with the IRS. That was followed this past December by the Consolidated Appropriations Act that had many, many bills rolled into it, including the FAFSA Act, which radically simplifies the FAFSA down to 36 questions or less and reinvents the expected family contribution into a student aid index and has some expanded Pell Grant eligibility. So these are all good news. All of you sitting at your laptops across the state know that there's always details and there's always implementation to manage. So there's a sooner and a later to the FAFSA simplification conversation. Sooner, and very breaking news that came out yesterday at noon, there's significant verification relief this cycle. For those of you who are very in the weeds, essentially, FSA is only going to focus on verifying the V4 and V5 groups, which means it is not going to focus on verifying the V1 group, which was largely about income, family size, and number in college. So they're putting a temporary pause on that for the balance of this cycle. If you have students who are currently in process of verification or who later get selected for verification, they need to contact their institutions immediately, mention this new guidance, and ask to be coded as selected, but not necessary to verify, so that they can continue moving through the process to an aid offer and package. Happy to answer more questions about that later, since that's really late breaking news. What we also learned last month is that the drug conviction question and selective service registration requirement, while they will remain on the form because it's too late in the cycle to get them off the form, guidance has been shared with institutions to essentially have no negative impact to these. So the students, if a student answered yes to the drug conviction question, the institutions will be instructed to not follow up and to basically minimize the effect of that question that remains on the paper and on the website, but will have no teeth per se. What's coming later, because it takes time to change systems, and we're hearing this is for the 24-25 academic year, is the implementation of that data sharing with the IRS that I mentioned, a slimming and streamlining of the FAFSA down to 36 questions or less. Some new lingo for us that changes expected family contribution to a student aid index. EFC is, as many of you know, confusing and not always the story or what we believe is an expected family contribution for a student and family. So student aid index seeks to change that a bit, and expanded Pell Grant eligibility, which will be tied to federal poverty level and number in family. Again, happy to get into the details, but the general idea is that this has been a huge policy win for NCAN and for students all across the country to simplify the FAFSA and get more aid to students, get them the aid for which they're eligible. Our second and top priority right now, given the movement we've had on FAFSA simplification, is to double the Pell Grant. Doubling the Pell Grant would restore the purchasing power that was there originally, and we are hoping to bring that up to 50% of the cost of attendance. It's a little bit easier to look at this graphically. So the historic high, when Pell Grant was created, the Pell Grant covered 79% of the cost of attendance. As currently appropriated for this year, we've had almost a flip of those numbers, in that the current Pell Grant only covers 29% of the cost of attendance. So it has really had some hits to its purchasing power, and despite some modest increases to keep up with inflation, really needs a boost to get back up to what we think are the legislative intents and the historic highs at its inception. I added on here the Biden proposal, which has two pieces, $400 in the appropriations bill and an additional $1,400 in the American Families Plan, would bring us back to the 64%, to the 36% cost of attendance. And then our double Pell, we're really looking to get to that 50%, so that there's a federal investment of about half of the cost of attendance for our students with the lowest income. Third one I'll mention has had a lot of action, no pun intended, deferred action for childhood arrivals, otherwise known as DACA, sometimes referred to as Dreamers as well, for students who were brought to this country as children. There's been a growing movement, and we're seeing more and more legislation that's proposing DACA student eligibility for Pell Grants, for all federal student aid, and as well as an inclusion in President Biden's proposal for free tuition at community colleges. Happy to dive into that more, but really just want to flag that this is a group that's previously been ineligible to apply for federal student aid, but the tide seems to be turning on that. I encourage all of you who want to be advocates to join us in NCAN's Virtual Advocacy Week. This is our third one. They've been really successful alternatives to what many of you might have done as the fly-in, or being from West Virginia, the drive-in to DC to meet with elected officials. If you're interested in that, you can check out our website at ncan.org under events, and you'll see more on Virtual Advocacy Week with trainings about topics and content, with leave behinds, and also with some helpful supports on how to reach out to and schedule meetings with your members and their staff. I will say that our advocacy and policy success is driven by the fact that we have such passionate advocates who fiercely advocate with student voice, which has been very exciting, and with the voices of those who support students. So appreciate all of you who have weighed in on these proposals and shared stories about the impact on their students, and look forward to seeing much more of that in months and years to come. So finally, I want to wrap up that normally, as you just heard, our federal policy priorities, like many associations and organizations, are a lot of asks and wish lists and require funding. However, this is a year which has been surprising in that lots of funding has become available from the federal government to support the work that we do in college access, success, persistence, and attainment. You may be familiar with hearing about the ESSER funds, but I just want to flag them quickly and talk about how they absolutely have allowable uses for much of the work that we do. So briefly, ESSER really came in 3 phases. You probably remember the CARES Act and the follow-up piece, and then really pale in comparison to the magnitude of the American Rescue Plan that was recently signed into law, passed by Congress. They total $190 billion, which is a stunning number compared to usual federal support for elementary and secondary schools, and have some interesting allowable uses for us. This money goes from the federal government first to the state education agency, and then the state education agency disperses it to local education agencies. I did check around for those of you who are curious or haven't yet seen that. Your West Virginia Department of Education has a handy chart that talks about the allocations to each school district for this money. They range from the 2.5 million to, I think you had 85 million in Kanawha County, Kanawha District. So this is big money, real money for 3 years. The exciting part is what you can do, or what you can work with your school superintendents to do to support high school seniors. It is completely allowable and encouraged to support post-high school planning, whether that's school counselors for the summer, support for FAFSA completion, summer bridge programs, student supports to complete the FAFSA, dual enrollment, many pieces here. So happy to share some more with you about that if that's of interest. This work can be performed by district personnel if the local education agency chooses to do that. It can also be contracted to community-based organizations, many who are trained and ready to hit the ground in these really specific pieces like FAFSA completion, summer bridge, battling summer melt, that are very important now and will continue to be important over the 3 years for which these funds can be used. So I rarely get to leave a session with here's some money for you to spend. Usually we have a lot of asking to do, but it's my pleasure to be able to leave this session with some good news about funds that you can access through your district and superintendent, whether you are directly that person or contracting out. So that is a lot of information in a little time. I hope it was helpful, not quite overwhelming, but again, encourage you to think of it as context setting and as motivational for the advocacy you're all about to continue to do for your students. And Elizabeth, I think we have a few minutes for questions if there were any.
We do have a few minutes. So if you have any questions, we have a couple of questions here. Please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A session to your right. But thank you so much, Ms. Cook, for sharing your insights. You did mention supporting high school seniors and students across the board. We know that those attending the Student Success Summit, of course, are passionate about the success of our West Virginia students. Collectively, what approaches can we as educators take, whether we work in K-12, higher ed, or through community organizations, to ensure fairness and opportunity for each student? What are some of the things you're seeing across the country that maybe could be replicated?
I think my two answers would be around data and around innovation. The first on data is to be data driven, to look at, for example, if you are thinking about FAFSA completion, to use the student level FAFSA completion data so that you know which students have completed the FAFSA and where your outreach is, and to individualize that as much as possible. So it's big data, but really individual outreach. And then related to that on innovation, I mean, we've heard there are great stories about the FAFSA drive-throughs and the FAFSA drive-ins. But what I'm hearing more and more from our community-based organizations and the districts we work with is the importance of really one-on-one outreach. And you will know what I mean by one-on-one outreach when I say phone banking is back with a vengeance. You know, we thought that was so old-fashioned now and everyone should text. Texts are getting to students, but really what I'm hearing from our direct service providers is the power of individual outreach, and just calling a student and saying, we see you haven't completed your FAFSA, or we want to check on what your plans are and how we can support you. And that's making a huge difference.
Thank you. And I know that here in West Virginia, a lot of our schools, and even on a county level, they've hosted FAFSA drive-in events, setting up appointments to provide that one-on-one support to students here in West Virginia. And it's remarkable to see what they're doing on the ground to reach these students. I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about attainment and retention. Are there any insights that you could share with the attendees from what you are seeing across the field in regard to systems of support to help students be retained at the post-secondary level, as well as, attainment in terms of the degree completion?
So some things I'm hearing on the ground about persistence are how much, and this is no news to any of you, that's tied to finances and aid. The importance of emergency aid, students being able to access, again, some federal funds that institutions have to help them with unexpected costs they had during the pandemic or adapting to remote learning. So there's always cost. And I think in this case, again, we have a situation where there is some funding to help address that. We have found and heard from our practitioners how important mental health supports are for students, how much of a challenge this has been. We as adults and grownups and practitioners ourselves have felt that, but we know our students have really felt pressures to adapt to new learning, to make that accessible and workable in different environments. So financial aid, mental health, we're hearing a lot of those.
We appreciate the time that you've taken with us today to lend your expertise and share some of the advocacy efforts that's going on a national through the national landscape. And so I don't see any additional questions that have come in, but I want to thank you, everyone, for joining us for this afternoon plenary session. Please feel free to visit the exhibitors hall as you prepare for your next session. It's scheduled to begin at 2:15 p.m. And don't forget to share the insights that you are learning throughout the conference on social media. Again, we'll be giving away some very nice prize packages. And again, to Ms. Cook, thank you for joining us and the educators here in West Virginia. We will see you all in the next session. Have a great day.
Thank you.